The planet is in deep trouble right now. The species is in deep trouble, and we need a rapid and deep and widespread change of consciousness on this planet. Cannabis is the sacrament of peace. I really do believe of all the psychedelics, cannabis has the greatest potential for changing the mind of the world.
Welcome to Higher Spirits, a podcast of elevated cannabis conversations with me, your host, Lexi Kafkis. Here we explore the powerful intersections of cannabis, spirituality, and mindfulness to better understand how to cultivate a conscious relationship with this plant. We journey with thought leaders and experts who bring a unique perspective on how cannabis connects us deeper to ourselves, our history, and the planet. Hello, plant fam. Welcome back to Higher Spirits. I'm excited to share a conversation with Stephen Gray, who is the author of the book Cannabis and Spirituality, an explorer's guide to an ancient plant spirit ally. And this book is amazing. I highly recommend it to everyone. I will link it into the show notes because it's not actually just written by Stephen. It is a collection of essays and thought pieces from practitioners and thought leaders from all around the world, from completely different backgrounds, on how to integrate cannabis into a mindful and spiritual practice. And Stephen is one of my favorite thought leaders when it comes to the intersection of cannabis and spiritual practice. His book was super influential on my own study of this plant. And honestly, having him here on the podcast feels like a really sweet full circle moment. And I actually encountered Stephen's book at a very, very pivotal time in my life. I had just sat with ayahuasca for the first time. I was 29 years old, and that experience completely changed my relationship to plants, as you would presume. And it was through that ceremony and that meeting Grandmother Aya that something cracked open in me, and I just understood on a whole new level that plants are not just substances. They're not just alive. They're not just pieces of nature, but they're spirits. And I was really expecting Grandmother Aya to tell me to stop working with cannabis, because I had talked with friends and that was their trajectory. They had sat with ayahuasca. They had actually then fallen away from smoking weed or working with cannabis in any way. But funny enough, what I heard instead, super clear, was that I needed to study her. So that study doesn't just mean consume more, but to learn, to listen, and to commune with her spirit and learn from this ritual, from this beautiful lineage of ayahuasca, learn how to create ritual and understand the spirit of the cannabis plant. And honestly, that's when I began my journey that has led me to creating this podcast. So as I said, full circle moments here. So I encountered Stephen's book. Honestly, I think it was the first book I picked up after I was determined to learn more about cannabis as a plant medicine. And it set me on the path of understanding cannabis as a plant ally, as a medicine, and as a tool for personal, emotional, spiritual transformation. And one of my favorite concepts from his book that I will continue to carry with me, and one that I found so helpful personally, and then especially when guiding others, so I hope you find it helpful too, is the idea that cannabis is a non-specific amplifier, meaning it will amplify whatever is present within you, consciously or subconsciously. So this is why intention is so crucial. Whenever I sit with cannabis in a mindful way, whenever I teach cannabis yoga or meditation or hold space for someone else, we always start with intention. If you come to cannabis with a clear intention, it will amplify that. But if you are holding onto stress or fear or anxiety, it will bring that to the surface too and amplify that. Think about, we've all, if not experienced ourselves, heard the story of, sometimes when I smoke weed, I feel amazing and creative and social and uplifted. And then other times I have smoked it or I've consumed it and I felt paranoid or anxious or heavy or terrible, or I get stuck in my head. So what is the difference between those two? Is what is in the body or what is in the mind is being amplified. So it's not cannabis that's making you paranoid. It's not cannabis that's making you anxious. It's not the plant's fault. It's not doing anything to you. It's simply showing you what you've been avoiding or what's sitting beyond or underneath your thinking mind. And for that, we should thank it, because if we don't know it's there, if we continue to keep it out of our thinking mind, we can't work through it, and it'll continue to seep its way in other parts of life. So this concept alone has helped me guide so many people to reframe their relationship to cannabis and take the blame off of the plant and to kind of move out of that victim mindset when working with cannabis. Stephen and I also talk about one of my favorite topics, which is cannabis as a gateway plant. And not in that old school fear-based DARE program sense. It's more, its gentle nature we talk about is what makes it one of the most accessible and powerful tools for beginning to work with altered states of consciousness and starting to lovingly examine the ego. So things like other plant medicines like ayahuasca, psilocybin, DMT, LSD, these other major psychedelics really take you out of reality. But something that's more gentle like cannabis is a beautiful place to start. And then one thing that also comes up in our conversation that I have to note, because honestly, it seems to be a reoccurring thing in coming up with every guest, is the potency of modern cannabis products. And Stephen and I both agree that the highly concentrated, crazy diamond-dusted, hash-infused madness, basically, that we see on dispensary shelves today is not supportive of mindful or intentional cannabis use. It's not it. So he shares that even when he's using more high-potency flowers, like 20-25%, he's only using 1 toke. And when I practice, I usually use a 10% flower, and I say only 1 to 3 tokes. This topic of potency is definitely important to keep in mind. And speaking of potency, this is a very potent episode with some of my favorite names in spiritual study mentioned. We talk about the great ancient Sufi poet Rumi. We talk about Eckhart Tolle, who's been one of the most influential teachers in understanding ego. And we also talk about Terence McKenna. And these are just to name a few. So let's dive in. We have a great conversation in store with the very deeply thoughtful Stephen Gray. Now, let's get higher. So for the viewers listening, this is Stephen Gray, incredible author of the book Cannabis and Spirituality, which is actually a collection of essays, which I was so excited to find out when I started reading this. And I came across your book in 2019. I mentioned this to you over email, which was also the year that I started my own personal journey into plant medicine. And I had been using cannabis in more, I'd say, social ways, and then also specifically to heal some injuries that I had for pain management. And I was doing my spiritual work kind of on the side. Did never really think of the spiritual implications of cannabis. And when I read your book, it was just like so much to uncover. So you really kind of blew my mind open a little bit with those collections of essays. And what I would really love to dive into is this idea of cannabis as a plant medicine, and not just as a recreational substance, and kind of how you, like, why cannabis? Of all the medicines you could have explored and written about, what drew you to this specific plant?
As far as actually writing about it or putting the book together? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've been interested in all the psychedelics, and I would like to include cannabis in that pantheon. The literal etymological source of the word psychedelic is from the Greek. Psyche and delic means mind manifesting or soul manifesting, and if you accept that definition of psychedelics, cannabis is a psychedelic potentially. It has a unique style, a unique imprint in the sense that it can be both really strong and gentle at the same time. Some people can be overwhelmed by it, depending on the dosage and the method of administration and so on, or if they can open to it, surrender to it, stay present with it, then it can feel like a very peaceful place to enter as well. So I mean, I came upon, as many people do, I came upon cannabis when I was young, and I was just always interested in it as just anything other than the boring sort of late mid-century or whenever that was, 50s, 60s, boring white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, button-down conformist, materialist world that I grew up in was interesting to me. Any sort of change of the channel was really interesting in general. And then I was also caught up in, swept up, I guess you could say, in the zeitgeist of the time, which, those of us who identified with it called it a counterculture. counter to the mainstream culture that I just described as being boring and lacking in some essentials, you might say. So cannabis was a part of that. Cannabis was a big part of that for people, that sort of getting a different perspective on life, as well as I say, other psychedelics in those days, particularly LSD. So I've always been interested in all those plants and in the spiritual sort of overarching worldview that they point toward, potentially, right? Ultimately, I like to think of cannabis as a reality medicine, if you use it in that way skillfully, that it's not for escape, and it's not simply for changing the channel just for the sake of changing the channel. It's potentially opens you more deeply into what is. Because we already have, as the Buddhists would say, we already have the mind of the Buddha. It's just obscured. Cannabis is a non-specific amplifier in that way, and it can amplify whatever direction you're going in, which is a whole issue in itself, because it can amplify negative directions or escapist directions just as easily. It's a very gracious plant that way. But yeah, so I didn't know anything really about its history on this planet at the beginning as a spiritual ally, as it were. That came much later. I just was really interested in the fact that it could change your perspective on things, and it opened up some things for me. It freed me. It freed the inner free dancer in me. It significantly, and I would even say maybe life-alteringly, shifted my understanding and ability to connect with music. I think it opened up, even though, again, dose-dependent, it can interfere with linear thinking. It also opened up ideation for me and writing and things like that. I was just interested in it for all those reasons. I especially loved, I still play music, and I've always loved what cannabis could do for music. That amplifier effect, maybe I should just say briefly, I'm not directly answering your question, but hopefully obliquely I'm getting there. Excuse me. The more biochemical definition or description, so to speak, and this would be, reductionist or limited description here, but nonetheless, and it's actually Joan Bellow in the Cannabis book talks a little bit about this. So as the way she puts it is that when you first have a puff or a toke, whatever the young people call it these days, our term was always toke, a toke.
I always say a hit these days.
A hit, yeah. So when you first have a hit, and that's not the case with orally ingested of one kind or another, whether it's a tincture and, a solid food thing or whatever, because that takes a lot longer to kick in, right? But when you first have a smoked or vaporized hit, the effect is obviously pretty much immediate. And then what happens is there's an increase in heart. It stimulates, at least at the minimum, a slight increase in heart rate. And what that's doing is it's pumping fresh, richly oxygenated blood throughout the organism. And so that opens up deeper breathing, potentially, but it also enhances sense perceptions. So, I loved listening at first to music in those days, like really listening, not just having it on in the room while you're chatting, but putting on headphones or something and just entering into a dance or a relationship with the music and really connecting with it on that level. It wasn't until much later, although actually there was a little book, I wish I could remember the name of it. It was quite a small book. I don't know, I just remember it being really thin and kind of small on cannabis that I came across in university, and he said something about how you could connect with God or something, and that kind of always struck me, but I don't remember anything else about that book. But over time, especially in the last 20 years or so, maybe it started to become increasingly present in my mind that while the use of cannabis, as you say, recreationally, or nowadays oftentimes for pain relief or whatever, different kinds of medical reasons, while the use of cannabis in general it's just everywhere, it's used more than alcohol now, probably. Anyway, there was the one central issue was missing in most people's awareness, and that was that it actually has a 10,000 or more year old history of use as a spiritual ally, particularly known in Asia. Where more than 10,000 years ago, there's some existing writing about that. And considering that the plant's been around, its lineage has been around for anywhere from 30 to 90 million years, as far as they know, that means because it grows easily in many environments, you could pretty much make a safe guess that our prehistory, in the sense of not having any written record, ancestors would certainly have found this plant. And this is actually central issue, not just about cannabis, but for humanity altogether at this point, is that indigenous people all over the planet historically found everything in their environment that they could use. You had to, it was survival, right? You had to know these plants. You had to know which ones could be used for food, for clothing, for building materials, for medicine. You had to know which ones were poisonous and were going to kill you if you ate them, So there's just it's just a no-brainer to me that people have always known, or even before what we might call people, some of our homo ancestors, the Neanderthals or various ones, they would have found this plant. They would have used it. All you need to do was, harvest or, like cut down a couple of them or throw it on the fire and stand a little too close. And the next thing you know, you're going. So the genesis of the book, the reason for the book was because I felt like this missing element, which arguably is the most important element or aspect or use of cannabis, is that it can deepen your connection to our true nature. As again, most people haven't particularly been aware of that in any direct sense or given it the space and time and intention, setting, as we say in the psychedelic world, so to speak, to open up that channel. You actually have to give it some space. You can't just be doing things all the time. Even again, listening to music, wonderful as that is, and quite powerful and quite moving, how that can be, is still adding an external element in there. So from my point of view, one of my influencers is the great Persian mystic poet Rumi. Do you know who Rumi was? Yeah, good. So he said a lot of things about that, poet. Not about cannabis, but he might have been influenced by cannabis because it was certainly around in the Middle East in his time.
Did Rumi the poet smoke cannabis?
Yeah, well, the Sufis, the inner mystical tradition of Islam, in that period of time, like from 1,000 years ago till 500 years ago and so on, and more recently than that, I think, but I don't think anymore. I think it all got quashed. But they were known for using cannabis spiritually, and that would have been in the area where Rumi was. So he certainly would have known about it. And, he may not have liked it, he may not have used it, but it might also have been expunged from his record because of the kind of censorship that would have come into later spiritual writings and so on. So regardless of that, Rumi had a number of things to say about the essential need to quiet the mind, and that's a central issue for Buddhist teachings and other great teachings as well. And psychonauts that work with ayahuasca and so on would say the same thing. You quiet your mind, you have to enter into the space. It's in the gap. Rumi said things like, silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation. And things like, don't let your thoughts cover the moon of your heart, or let go of thinking so you can enter the core of life. Things like that. I'm slightly, extemporizing or misquoting him, but the gist is there on some of those. I don't remember the exact wording of all of them. Oh, the first one I do, for sure. Silence is the language of God, all else is poor translation. That's an exact repetition of something that he wrote. To access the greatest potential of cannabis, especially, again, as a spiritual ally, if you will, requires an intention to do that, for starters, and giving yourself the place, the space to allow your mind to quiet down some of the time. And it's a challenge, obviously, because the amplifying effect also potentially amplifies thinking, and there's nothing wrong with thinking in its right place. Obviously, we're thinking beings, right? And we use it, and cannabis can be very useful as a creative ally, as many people know. But the problem is, and I'll use the Buddhist way of talking about it here because it's quite straightforward. We're all afraid of the non-existence of this fictional self that we've been putting together for our whole lives, right? It's, it's ego. It's called ego in Buddhist teachings and in psychology. Ego doesn't necessarily mean like big ego, like certain people we might know that have, that are arrogant and self-important. It's not like that. That's kind of an extreme version of ego, you might say. It's that the ego, the definition or understanding of ego is that it's a collection of beliefs, concepts, and so on that we have been forming within ourselves from the moment we were born, and actually carrying over much of it from much of our programming, you might say, from past lives as well. But for the purposes of this particular incarnation, from the moment we've been able to be aware of the world around us, we've been calculating how to deal with it. It's overwhelming. So taking on from what our parents teach us or show us, we learn from every way that they behave, and our teachers at school and the culture and the media and all that stuff. We form an identity to survive. Great psychologists like Otto Rank, for example, called it the lie, the lie of personality. Other psychologists have called it the false or provisional personality. Not to judge it, because we all do it for survival. However, it's placing ourselves within a cocoon or a fortress, in a sense, to protect ourselves. Yeah. And so what we've done is we've shut out a whole bunch of information. And the most central aspect of that is the fact that we are, as Buddhists would say, we are Buddha. The word Buddha just is a translation from the Sanskrit for the word awake or awakened or enlightened. And that is everybody's true nature. So cannabis can actually open up, nudge open the channels or the doorways into that space. But
and I like that you use the word nudge.
The way that the issue of the ego is that ego's primary strategy for protecting itself is the thinking mind. Right? Yeah. So we create these kind of layers or veils that we protect ourselves with by keeping our minds active. And so that's why Rumi says silence is the language of God. Silence meaning calming the mind, quieting the mind. And it's hard enough to do in any case. Like, how many of us, including myself, could sit down on a cushion and, just do a simple meditation practice of paying attention to the breath and, just keep it real simple like that and have no thoughts for half an hour? How many people can do that? I don't think very many people can do that. Eckhart Tolle claims he could do it, the guy that wrote The Power of Now.
He's actually been coming to mind a lot with everything that you're speaking of. He was probably my greatest teacher in understanding the ego.
Yeah, Tolle, in his book, The Power of Now, he said, the attitude you want to take to your thinking mind is that it's a tool, and the mature or sort of ultimate relationship you want to have with that tool is that it's you, so to speak, are in control of that tool. You can pick it up when you need to use it, but you're fully capable of putting it down when you don't need to use it. Unfortunately, for most of us, we're not capable of having that control to put the thinking mind down. And again, it's because it functions sort of on an unconscious or semi-conscious level as a smokescreen that keeps the awakened state obscured, right? So because cannabis is an amplifier, it can amplify our entry into that space. But for the same reason, it also can be more challenging because it raises the stakes, and so there's this kind of like little light, or little warning signal goes off in the mind, like, the status quo is being threatened here, the ego that I've been putting together so carefully and so meticulously for 20, 30, 40, 50 years is starting to be shown to be non-existent or just a collection of stories that live in the mind, right? Yeah, so that's essentially why I wanted to do this book, because I began to understand that it has this amazing potential that can change the world on some level. If enough people understood this and used cannabis that way, there would be a lot of lights going on, going off or going on. Yeah, so... But then I realized that, I knew that, there's a lot of people with knowledge of that, and I'm just one of them. And I didn't feel like I had a whole book in it, just of my writing or my ideas. So I thought, I want to hear from other people on this issue. So I did some of the sort of the practical stuff, like, suggestions about how to sit with it, or issues on strains and dosage and all that kind of stuff, and some of the principles behind it. But then I brought in 17 other contributors.
Yeah, beautiful. Oh, so many threads I'd love to pull on there. And I think that, the biggest impetus for me as well, wanting to explore this, is the lack of knowledge and education around this. And it's so bewildering. And I have to believe that there's a universal reason that we're rediscovering it right now. But I'd be curious to know, because we're entering this, I would say, in the past 10, 15 years, right? We're seeing this surge of, and not even more the past 5, that psychedelics are really coming onto the mainstream. I mean, literally today, Oprah posted a video about them. I'm like, oh, man, it's really happening. Why don't you think cannabis is included in this conversation? I ask myself this a lot, especially in some spiritual communities. It's almost kind of like looked down upon a little bit. And I just would be curious to know, after all of your conversations and work and your learnings, why you think it's categorized so differently.
So you're asking me why cannabis is not getting its due in the psychedelic conversation?
Yeah.
Essentially, yeah. Okay. Excuse me. Yeah, well, yeah, let me think about that one for a second. Well, okay, so this is just, I don't know, kind of general narrative way of looking at it. It's not necessarily exact, but this is my kind of best take on that. If you take a relatively strong dose of a psychedelic like psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca, it basically, that plant or plant spirit, which is a whole other issue, which I'm big on, is going to grab you by the scruff of the neck and say, "You're coming with me." You don't really have you're not going to be getting up and wandering around and picking up a book and reading it, and all this kind of stuff on a strong dose of one of those psychedelics. Cannabis, on the other hand, although in strong doses, really strong doses, like an oral, strong dose, you'd have some problems with, activity. But with most doses, you can ignore that. You can make your mind busy. You can pick up that book. You can put on that song. You can watch a movie. You can get into a conversation with somebody. That can distract you from that. It's a delicate ally that way, I find, like, at least once a week, I don't use cannabis every day. I don't think that works for a lot of people, unless you're using it for medical reasons. But if you're thinking of using it as a spiritual friend, I think you need to give some space, let the endocannabinoid system reset, clean itself out, etc., so that it can be strong and clear the next time you do it. Plus, there's a tendency, because it's so lovely, if it works for you, tendency to keep wanting to go back to it, and then that can be a trap as well. It can get some serious diminishing returns, dependency, what people sometimes call addiction going on, right? So I try to get once a week where I just do it alone, get out my meditation cushion, get out my little dinger and start it like a ceremony, and then I'll just sit there, have a puff, a hit, pretty much always one to start with, and then just see where that goes for a while, and then maybe a top up 45 minutes or an hour later kind of idea. And I just sort of spend time with it, getting to know it that way and just getting to know the space. And I actually forgot while I was telling you that in regard to what we were just talking about. Can you refresh my memory? Just describing how I use it, but there was a reason for that I've forgotten.
Yeah, of how it's more gentle and you can do other things.
Right, of course. Yeah. So pardon me. So for example, I play music, as I said, and sometimes I'd get a musical idea and I'd want to go over and pick up my guitar. So I pick up my guitar and I play for a bit. And while I'm doing that, and this is just one example of the kind of things that you might actually be, quote, doing, it doesn't feel that strong, because you're focusing on an external, direction somehow. You're putting your energy and your attention into something that you're doing. And then I'll go, this is kind of mild, but then I'll put down the guitar and go back to my cushion and go, oh, no, this is not mild. In other words, what I'm saying is this is a massive difference between how clear and strong this opening effect can feel if you give yourself some space. So as I said earlier, the challenge, because of the amplifying effect, is that smoke screen effect can be raised as well. And it gets kind of tangled in with the idea that you get these great ideas oftentimes as well, and they're very seductive and you want to run with them and so on if you're a creative person or something like that, or you just think it's a great idea altogether. So it becomes more challenging to do that. Then all you can do really is just keep coming back. Rumi said that in one of his little poems. He said, if you break your vow 1,000 times, just keep coming back. So the vow in that sense was your intention. What was your intention? If your intention was to try to understand this plant as a spiritual ally, then you have to intend to give it some space and intend to sit in silence with it some of the time that you use it. Not necessarily all the time, but for some of the time. Anyway, some of the times that you use it and some of the time within a particular session, maybe, that you're using it. You might even, for example, I didn't put this in the book, but for example, if somebody is interested in finding that out about cannabis, you might start small. For example, you say, make a promise to yourself and, set your the alarm on your phone or your wristwatch or something for, I don't know, something simple, 15 minutes maybe, and say, okay, for 15 minutes, I'm not going to do anything else. I'm going to sit here. I'm going to have a straight back, nothing fancy. Don't need to go into lotus posture or something, but just straight back so that the energy moves up and down easily on a chair or on a cushion or whatever. If you have a meditation cushion, great. I'm just going to commit myself to 15 minutes of not getting up, not writing anything down, not calling a friend, not checking my phone, whatever, right? And the thoughts come up. And this is basic. There's a basic kind of, you might call, universal practice of meditation. Buddhists have elucidated it quite clearly, Buddhist teachings. It's almost a non-practice because it's, in a sense, accessible to everyone on the planet. It doesn't require any kind of belief system or anything. And that is, on the simplest level, just be present. But that can be challenging. Well, it can be challenging even with some quote-unquote technique. But the simplest functional kind of meditation that can work is that you just sit there and you give a gentle attention to your breath. So the lovely thing about the breath is that it happens all the time, right? 24 hours a day. It's not something that you have to, in a sense, control, right? You can control it, but if you just let it be your anchor into being present, it's the perfect tool for that, or the perfect function for that, right? It's part of the autonomic nervous system, just goes on all the time, right? So when I say a gentle attention, the way that we were taught, I was a Buddhist student for a long time and a meditation instructor, is that you don't want to sort of hyper-focus on the breath. That can be too narrow focused, right? You want to have the breath as this anchor, but still have a sense of the space around it. Our practice was actually eyes open. Obviously, a lot of people would think meditating, you would close your eyes, but the way our teacher taught it to us was, again, it's not meant to be this sort of exotic, holy, special thing, sitting down to meditate. It's a way to train yourself to be more present. And so, because the rest of your life, the other 15 hours a day, your eyes are open, why not just leave your eyes open, but soft focus, like not kind of looking around, not staring, just kind of lower your gaze. You know, they typically said keep your gaze about 2 meters, 6 feet in front of you so that you're not taking in too much, but you're also not making a big deal out of like trying to close your eyes and close it off. It's just part of your world, right? It doesn't have to be a perfect environment. You know, cars go by, maybe outside, big deal. That's just part of the environment, right? But the thoughts come up inevitably. And so the way that we were taught to process or deal with the thoughts is, don't make a big deal about it. Doesn't matter what the content of the thought is. You know, we had this saying, no praise, no blame. In other words, you know, you have this thought that, oh, I'm the greatest thing since sliced bread, you know, I'm Donald Trump or whatever, you know, I'm really important. I just did something great,
Talk
or I'm
about
going to do
ego.
something great. You know, whatever, you know, no praise for the thought, whatever it is, and no blame. Like, you know, I'm terrible or whatever, you know, I'm a loser, you know, all those kinds of that general direction of thinking. Just acknowledge it, that it's there. And then if you do that enough without cannabis, or with or without cannabis, basically, if you do that often enough, you start to realize, and this is the sort of central to the whole thing, that your thoughts are not you. They're just these things that arise in the moment, in this exact moment. My old Buddhist teacher called it temporary clouds. And if it's negative, he called it temporary vomit. But the space, again, referencing our old friend Rumi there, it's the space in between those thoughts where we can enter into a deeper, truer, unconditional reality in that sense, right? Yeah. So if you want to use cannabis as an ally that way, you might, for example, say, okay, I'm going to promise myself, commit to whatever, 10, 15, 20 minutes of just sitting and work with it like that. You know, watch the thoughts come up. They can be very insistent, you know, but, you know, the way we were taught meditation practice, again, no cannabis involved with that in the Buddhist world, but doesn't matter if you have thoughts coming and coming and coming. You don't make an issue of that either. You just keep recognizing it when they come up and letting them go and coming back to the breath as your anchor back into the present, right? And so it's a complicated topic in a sense. It sounds simple, but it's complicated in a way because it is challenging, and you can't have any expectation either of what will happen. It can be absolutely wonderful. You can deepen into a state of peace, open up your heart. All those things can happen, but it could also be boring. You might be going, why would I do this? I've got all this energy. I could be doing something, I could be running around. I could be playing music, whatever. Some people like doing the house cleaning high, them.
Yeah,
But
it is a little better.
was that?
I said it is a little better when with a little bit of cannabis.
Can be, yeah. As my old friend Neil used to say, it puts a shine on things,
Yeah.
But that's all very well. And, as I say, if basically what it comes down to as far as general use for people is who's running the show here? Are you using it as a tool in the way that you want to and that benefits your life, or are you in the grip of it that you feel like you need it? And I feel like I need it, but I only feel like I need it once in a while. I'm not going to do it all the time because I'm aware I did that for a while in my 20s, and I found out for myself that it can have this diminishing returns effect. And in fact, I actually kind of got depressed for a while from using cannabis all the time in my early 20s. But now it's more like a refresher, a dip in the pool of wisdom, because it's really the daily walk where the real action is, you might say. That's where you have to put the pedal to the metal or your foot to the floor, literally, step by step, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So knowing that it's, like you were talking about, who's in control, what do you think about the potency?
That's
cannabis on the merchants.
That's a really interesting question. So can you hold that thought for a minute? Because I don't feel like I properly answered your previous question about why cannabis isn't fully respected in the psychedelic world. And so part of the answer, as I understand it, is that it isn't as sort of unequivocal in the way that it's going to take you in, as these other ones all they are. They can seem more powerful. But frankly, that's not answering that question, but frankly, it can take you as deep. Even Terence McKenna has said that, the great philosopher of the Stone said, in the right kind of context and understanding, cannabis can pretty much elicit all the experiences of other psychedelics, So I'm not exactly sure why. Maybe because it is so widely used that, it's like people are not going around having slugs of ayahuasca, and there's no wake and drink movement going on, right? And psilocybin mushrooms quickly have a tolerance effect. If you're eating mushrooms all the time, I haven't done it, but I think you're not going to have strong experiences. I'm told that if you were to try to do 2 grams Monday and then again Tuesday and Wednesday, by Wednesday you wouldn't be experiencing much, I think. It's just not the way that people use those. So cannabis is this kind of seen as this sort of everyday recreational substance in that sense, But for me, that's a misunderstanding about or a lack of understanding about its spiritual potential. So that could be part of the reason that it's just always been by most people used as a more of a quote unquote recreational substance, which is not generally the case with mushrooms or LSD or peyote or ayahuasca, for example, right?
I see a lot of power in that, though, no? Because it's more of the people's plant, like the gentleness of her. I think it makes that mind-altering experience more of an introduction. It truly can be a gateway drug if used in the right way.
I agree with you. And, I'm trying to keep in mind to get back to your question about potency and dosage, but 2 of the writers, the contributors to the cannabis book, referred to cannabis as the sacrament of peace. And I really do believe of all the psychedelics, cannabis in some sense has the greatest potential for changing the mind of the world, if you will, because it's so accessible. You don't have to, you can work with it alone. You don't have to have, like with ayahuasca, for example, I would never sit with anybody who isn't thoroughly trained and impeccably perfect, so to speak. Ethically impeccable is what I meant to say. That I know a lot of ayahuasqueros, and the good ones, they've done it right. They've been apprenticing for years. They've done all the diets. They've connected with the songs. I mean, the songs are actually spirits in a sense. You don't just make up Icaros for that. And so it's a long process, and I wouldn't take ayahuasca. I mean, some people could take ayahuasca alone, but I wouldn't. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. But cannabis, it's really, okay, so this leads back, maybe this could lead back to dosage issues, because you can titrate the dosage quite easily with cannabis, especially with smoking, not so easily with oral, of course. But there's a well-known saying, I'm sure you've seen it, in the general world of cannabis, not the spiritual world, so to speak, but start low and go slow. You've heard that one,
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah. So especially with a new strain that you cultivar that you haven't tried before, like it can be too much. The stuff is so strong these days. Yeah. So cannabis allows you that. The sacrament of peace aspect of that is that it's accessible. You can manage the dosage easily. You don't need to be part of a circle, with that you've paid $250, $300, $400 to sit in,
Yeah.
and excuse me. And it has this, as you said, Lexi, this potential to have a sort of a gentle opening as well, even though, as you also said, and I agree, that it can be quite powerful that way, but it's kind of unique in the psychedelic pantheon. And I have worked with pretty much all of the known ones to one degree or another. I've done a lot of peyote with the Native American church. I've done lots of ayahuasca ceremonies. I used to do LSD more so when I was younger. I've done 5-MeO DMT a few times, MDMA a few times, and so on, right? So I am familiar with, in general, how these substances tend to work. And again, coming back to cannabis, it's unique in the sense of this, way that this both powerful and gentle way that it works. So, and it's safe in that sense, right? If you know what you're doing, if you have titrated your dosage properly, the problems happen when people overdo it and they don't know how to handle the reality medicine aspect of it. People don't realize that's another aspect of this spiritual use or lack of understanding of that, is that if you get freaked out or nauseous, dizzy, paranoid, all those things, as I understand it, those are all symptoms of your inability to surrender to the plant. People would say, well, paranoia, the paranoia is just paranoia. It happens, right? I don't think it's that simple. My understanding of paranoia, I think it's reasonably accurate anyway, is, there may be other sources or other causes, but with cannabis, people talk about it fairly often as one of the things that can happen. So I think it's worth examining. What is paranoia? So paranoia is fear. You're afraid when you're paranoid, right? Yeah. So I call it paranoia, or I call paranoia fear with a story. So that it's like fear can be inchoate. You don't necessarily know what you're afraid of sometimes, but paranoia is you're specifically afraid of a perceived threat of some kind or another.
Yeah.
But it's all about me. It's very self-absorbed. It's just all me, and the world or whatever is a threat to me. So cannabis wants to invite you out of that control, ego kind of space. And it can make you feel really vulnerable for that reason and exposed, A friend of mine once said it's embarrassing. He feels embarrassed sometimes when he gets high. It exposes that real self, that vulnerable self, that softer, open-hearted self. And so the paranoia is a version of resistance, as to some of these other symptoms, I think. But this comes back again potentially to the dosage issue, the start low and go slow thing. So I think I said it in the book somewhere that I think the optimal dosage for this kind of use is the dosage that you both want to and can handle, right? So the want to is how deep do you want to go, because you can go quite deep. And the can is at what dosage level or strength of effect level can you stay present and not get taken by just like obsessive thinking constantly that allows no space, or nervousness or fear or anxiety, paranoia, or even nausea, dizziness, things like that, right? That suggests you've done more than you can handle in that little idea, right? Can, want to. Yeah. So it's a little trickier these days in some ways maybe than it was when I was young, because the potency is generally quite a lot higher than it was in those days. For me, that's not a problem. I actually prefer the strong cannabis because, for one thing, I don't have to have as many hits, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and you have the tools and the experience to manage that sensation and that
exactly.
level of,
So, as I mentioned a little while ago, when I'm sitting with cannabis alone, I will Well, actually, to be honest, or completely, disclosing, as it were, lately I've gotten into this routine of having I've made it. Somebody gave me some tea bags of psilocybin mushroom tea, and she said that one of those tea bags is equivalent of well, in Canada would be a liter, like about 30 ounces or so. Pardon me. One of those would be equivalent to 1 dried gram of mushrooms.
Okay.
If she suggested I make a tea of measure the amount of water out to a liter, which is around a little over 30 ounces. And so like 1/10 of that would be a little 3 ounces. So I would have like 2 ounces of this little tea before smoking. And what that does for me is it just sharpens things up a little. Just a little bit of clarity or something comes into it, mental clarity. And then I'll sit down, do my little ritual, hit the gong, say a dedication, smudge the space, and then I'll have one toke, and a sizable one, nice cloud coming out. And then I'll just sit with that, as I mentioned earlier, for maybe 45 minutes to an hour. And then usually by then, that sharpness of that initial experience has softened a little bit by then. And then I'll have a top up, another one toke. Rarely would I ever do more than one more toke. Yeah. But, if you're talking THC potency of 20 to 25%, that's pretty strong, right?
Absolutely.
So, and another thing about that too is, people are that you're asking about potency and dosage and so on. Like there's a lot of super strong cannabis around now with the dabs and shatters. And I once bought these, they were called caviar cones, just because I'd heard about them and I was curious, and do you know about those kind of things?
No, what's a caviar? I mean, I know what dabs and shatters are, but I haven't heard of a caviar cone.
Yeah, well, these are pre-rolls, and they're made with strong flour and then sprinkled on a bunch of hash, ground up hash, and then maybe soaked in a little bit in hash oil as well. And then the paper itself sometimes I think has actually been marinated in, or sprayed or something with, hash oil or something like that. So I went
Sounds
to
like a rocket ship.
ridiculous from my point of view. So it's not about if you're just there, if you just want to get totally blasted, that's not a sacred use of cannabis at all. I don't think, one doesn't want to overgeneralize, but for example, I get some cannabis from a fellow who works still in the underground. Cannabis is legal in Canada, you probably know, but I prefer knowing the grower if I can and what their intention was. And I know this guy's really careful and loves his plants and everything's organic and all that. But he says his buyers, he mostly does indicas because that's what his buyers want. They want to get couch locked. They want to go, So, that's not what I'd call a spiritual use of cannabis in a general sense. You want to be present, you want to be calm, you want to be clear, you want to be connected to your heart ideally, or allow it to open, et cetera, right? So start low and go slow. Pay attention to, especially again, if you're trying a new cultivar strain that you haven't tried before, and find your optimal range, and then if you're able to sit with it, as for part of the time that you spend time with cannabis, or some of the times that you meet it, then extend the length of time you do that with, maybe over time. That's just it's an idea for people. And then see how deep you want to go. One of the contributors to the book, I used a pseudonym for him, actually. I'm forgetting what I think we called Mariano da Silva or something like that was the name I used in the book. I know him by another name, but he didn't want his name used. Excuse me, because he's part of the ayahuasca church and it's controversial there. Anyway, both cautions people about overdoing it. And he says that in his chapter. I actually asked him about that one time. And he said, well, there are also times, so the simple principle is less is more. Because it's not about trying to get somewhere exactly. That can be a trap, a trick. It's like allowing yourself to deepen into what's already potential, the Buddha mind, as it were, right? So if you have an attitude of seeking something, that can be a problem potentially, right? From that point of view, less is more is a good principle, which is similar to the, start slow or low and go slow idea. But then when I asked him, he said, well, sometimes more is more. And it depends on the people and the condition, the situation, the setting, the environment. So when you're with people who are reasonably well processed, so to speak, that can actually handle, as I was saying, optimal levels can want to handle, right? That can actually handle a stronger energy, a stronger space. These are often people that have experience with meditation, experience with other medicines like ayahuasca and so on, know how to surrender to the power of an altered state that way. Then you can go deeper. In fact, since I'm not using his name, I think I can say a little more about how they do this. Occasionally, when they couldn't get the ayahuasca, they have a whole ritual, and it's the Santo Daime Church. They use ayahuasca as their sacrament, and they have a ritual where they have songs and prayers and things like that, and they serve everybody a drink of the ayahuasca, or they call it daime, near the beginning. And then depending on the situation, if it's an evening one, they might do one top-up. If it's an all-day one, they might do two more top-ups. They will sometimes, they can't get the ayahuasca. Rarely, but in the past, I've heard stories from these people that I knew up here that they occasionally, rarely, but occasionally they couldn't get the ayahuasca. And so what they did was they made a liquid, drinkable form of cannabis and did the same ritual as they would have otherwise. Like people come up, somebody serves them a little drink of it, and so on and so on. So it has a different kind of trajectory, obviously. It takes a lot longer to kick in. I think liquids come to full effect faster than a solid, I think. Don't quote me exactly on that, but I think so. Because, it's liquid. It moves through the system a little faster than having to digest a solid food like a brownie or a cookie.
It gets
or
to
that.
Your liver a little quicker.
Yeah. Excuse me. Sorry. So they told me that people had essentially the same effect with the cannabis that they did with the ayahuasca when they did that ritual, using cannabis as a substitute. Yeah. So I'm not sure what else to say about the dosage issue. Strains make a difference, but you basically just have to experiment. The sativa indica thing is no longer scientifically accurate as far as I know, because there's just too much hybrid mixing going on. The only way that dichotomy or continuum is useful, in my opinion, is that if something is described as a sativa, it probably means the people who grew it or sold it found it to be uplifting. So they just called it a sativa. And the same on the other end of it. Typically you probably want some kind of a hybrid in the middle, but everyone is going to have to experiment. That's one of the beauties of cannabis. You can do that. You can just keep experimenting, right? Like, this one isn't working for me. Some are not going to sit with you well at all. Cannabis is not for everybody anyway. Some people are just too sensitive for it. Some people are, in a sense, already there and don't need any help that way. And it's also a metabolism, but it's a genetic makeup. Everyone's genetic makeup is a little different, and some people's genetic makeup, they don't process cannabis in the same way that other people do, So anyway.
Yeah, everyone's different.
I'm sure, we haven't covered anywhere near all your questions, and I'm sorry about that.
Oh my gosh, no.
But I
know we're on our time here. This has been such a great conversation, and I would love to close with one question.
Absolutely, yeah. And by the way, before you do that, you sent me a list of questions, and we haven't covered more than half of them at most, I'm sure. So if you want to do this again, I'm up for it as well. Just let me know.
Okay.
So what's that last question?
I love that. To be continued. The last question is, so you mentioned twice, and you mentioned in the beginning, you're like, cannabis in your perspective, and I share this
could you speak up a little bit, please?
Oh, yeah. So you were saying cannabis has the potential, more than any other medicine, to change the world. And we were also talking about that in its gentleness. How, in what ways can it improve the world? Like, how do you see it making a better, more positive impact on the world?
Well, it's a long way to Tipperary, as the old World War II song says, because of this sort of potential safety, mental quality that it has, that you can control your dosage and work with it that way, because of its easy accessibility and affordability. I mean, mushrooms are pretty cheap to grow, obviously, but they're another kind of situation. It's more accessible to more people, cannabis is, and I think for those reasons, its accessibility, its easiness to grow, its flexibility, its potential gentleness, and the way that it can connect you to yourself and to others, it has the potential, just on a sort of a practical level, of being the most widely used of the spiritual sacraments. Again, obviously not everyone's going to use it that way and never will. I think, I mean, this really would require another conversation, but the overarching concern or issue to the whole thing is that the planet is in deep trouble right now. The species is in deep trouble, and in fact, the whole planet is in deep trouble right now. We need a rapid and deep and widespread change of consciousness on this planet. Cannabis used in these ways, it's not hard to understand how it can be done. It's more accessible, again, because you can do it in a casual situation. You don't have to fly to Peru. You don't have to seek out, the best ayahuasca you can or whatever. You don't have the same kind of safety issues that you do with a strong, these, quote unquote, strong psychedelics. You can explore it on your own with a couple of friends. You don't need a shaman, again, all that stuff. It's the universal sacrament of peace, potentially. Simple as that, Like I say, it's a long way from here to there, but it has that potential. And my best guess, in the sort of 25 words or less category is that people are going to feel more and more need for a different way of seeing the world, because this one isn't working very well and it's self-destructing,
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for your perspective, your work, your beliefs, all of the time that you've put into cultivating this information and just your willingness to share it. I'm so grateful. So grateful.
Most welcome. Happy to do it. And thank you for your interest. And you've been a really nice interviewer.
We're here just to understand the inner workings of our minds. So
thank you. Bye-bye.
Don't forget to subscribe to support this plant-powered exploration. And if you have any questions, are curious, or have ideas for collaborations, give me a follow on Instagram at HigherLexi. I also want to remind you that we're not making any medical recommendations or claims on this podcast. And if you do choose to explore cannabis, please do so mindfully. And until next time, keep the vibe high, friends.